So after 12 weeks of training, I hit the streets of Abingdon to try and attempt to break my marathon PB. Things didn't quite go to plan, but I did end up running my second fastest marathon ever, which I'm really excited about, and today is all about the race recap. So welcome back to another video. Really excited to unpack everything that happened on the streets of Abingdon Marathon for you guys, so you have a bit more of an insight into how things went. As I said, it was my second fastest marathon I've ever run, but obviously not the time that I wanted, and there's so much to talk about. I'm going to try and condense it and keep it short and sweet. I'll put chapters up on the video so that you guys can flick through to the areas that you might be interested in. We'll start with a bit of prep. We'll talk about how I was never really on for that sub 2:38 anyway, how goals had to change in and around sort of mile 4 or 5, and then talk about how the race went on, how I pulled up from it, and yeah, talk about all of that good stuff. So without further ado, let's just dive straight in. So just a quick note on the preparation in terms of how I approached the start line and when I got to the start line itself. I think the stars aligned in that area because I've never approached the start line of a marathon in as good a shape as I have, with no niggles, no injuries. The carb load went really well. I felt mentally sharp, like mentally I had got myself in a place where I was ready to attack this marathon, go for that goal and really shoot for it. So in terms of the preparation, I obviously laid everything out. I got mentally all my strategies in place. I've done a lot of visualization. Physically, I was in an amazing place in terms of like the taper had come down really well. As I said, carrying no niggles or injuries into the race, and it was just a case I was raring to get go that day. So in terms of that aspect, nothing really to touch on. Everything went really well. And obviously the only thing that didn't go to plan was the weather. Sadly, Storm Ashley hit us on that sort of Sunday morning, and the really frustrating thing is when we were driving home that evening, yeah, it was still relatively windy, but the rain had completely gone. It was nice and sunny, and literally it just hit us for that that Sunday morning. So you've got to think to yourself, what are the chances? But there's nothing you can do. I said it in the build-up. I was trying to let it not get into my head. You can only control the controllables, and all I had done is put myself in the best position to run as best as I could. I couldn't control the weather. There was nothing I could do, and I was going to try not to dwell on it and adapt my race plan to suit. Now, obviously, to the point where that storm was very frustrating for a lot of people. I'm a coach as well as an athlete, and a couple of my athletes are running races. They still managed PBs, which was absolutely incredible, so shout out to them. But I think they struggled in the weather too. Their races didn't quite go to plan. The Great South Run was cancelled as well, which was a real shame. That's a huge race here in the UK, but then any race down by the coast, which the Great South Run is going to be affected way more by a storm because the wind's whipping off the sea. It's going to be way more worse than it is somewhere inland like Abingdon was. So it was just a bit of a crazy morning, a little bit surreal really, when you train for so long and then something like this happens literally at that pocket of time, and then a few hours later everything's okay again. So it did seem a little bit weird, but do you know what? There was nothing I could do about it at the time. So I went in there with an adapted race plan ready to kick on. So let's get into the race details. Now, I knew a few people had said in the comments over the last few weeks that they were aiming for in and around the same sort of time as me. So I knew there might be a few runners, but then when we got to the start line, I was chatting to a few people there. And again, more people were saying that they were going for a similar sort of time. So I was relatively confident we'd have some kind of pack going for this sub 240 time, which I kind of adapted in my mind already. I said in the intro, I was alluding to maybe changing the goal very early. I went out there with a bit of a cautious approach, and my goal was always to run the first sort of 2 or 3 miles a little bit off pace, and then by mile 3 have locked in to goal race pace. The reality was that did happen, but the course didn't lend itself at that moment in time to really locking into that 236, 238 area. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that now. Effectively, you start on an athletics track. What happens is you run sort of like... you do a small 5-mile loop, and then you go out, and then you hit the big 9-mile loop twice, and then by the time you finish the 9-mile loop, you're on around 24-ish miles, 23 and a half, 24 miles, and then you've just got the final 2 back to the finish. Now, in terms of the wind direction, I knew that in and around 3 miles, as we were coming around that first loop, 3 up to 5, where we hit the first part of the loop, or 5.5, that was going to be a bit of a headwind, and lo and behold, that's where it hit. And then when we hit the 9-mile loop, I knew that the first part of that loop, so the first 4 miles, was going to be a headwind. And then the final sort of like 4.5, let's say 4.5 out, 4.5 back roughly, I knew that the second half was going to be a tailwind. So we'd have to contend with that again. And then hopefully at the point where we hit 19 miles-ish at the top of the second loop, we'd have a tailwind all the way to the finish. That was kind of the race plan in my head, that I would try and save some for that point, so that I could utilise the tailwind and finish strong at the end. So effectively what happened was we headed out of the racetrack and we got into miles 1, 2 and 3, clicked into a nice groove. In my head I'd said to myself I want around a 6:20 mile, then 6:10 and then lock into 6:05s. I hit a 6:18, which was pretty much perfect for the first mile, really controlled. Heart rate was like 140s, which is my moderate area. That was great. We dropped down a little bit more because it is a net downhill for those first 3 miles, and we kind of got ticking along nicely, brought those mile paces down, and we locked in at mile 3, feeling really good, and we had a good at that point, a good group around us. And at this stage we then turned and we came towards that section I was talking about where we'd start to hit a bit of a headwind. But what happened on that was that the weather has been so bad in the UK, we've had so much rain lately, that this stretch of single track, normally concrete road, or I should say is a cycle track or a cycle path, was absolutely caked in mud. Obviously not the organisers' fault, nothing to do with them. The weather had just played havoc with us here in the UK for such a long time. It was like running through a mud bath. So first of all, and I did catch on camera myself saying a bit of an expletive that I'll put on screen now. This is nuts. I didn't sign up for a railway. You should. Yeah. And I'd just like to reiterate, that's no reflection on anything other than the fact that the weather had done some damage to the course at that point. So we had a good stretch, right, of about a mile and a half that almost felt like we were trail running. It really did. It was quite slippery, a bit sloshy, but I knew that obviously when we got out the other side it would be fine because we'd be on the main loop. So that was the first kind of challenge. And when you run in those sorts of conditions, you're kind of expecting, I guess, to be running on nice flat tarmac. Super shoes aren't best suited for that sort of weather, so had to be a bit careful down there. Mile split slowed a little bit, but not a problem. We got out of there, hit the 5-mile mark, went through town, saw my wife, got out of there, hit mile 5, and that is really where the wind started to hit. I want to take this opportunity to say a massive thanks to Saysky for sponsoring this last video in the Abingdon Marathon training series just before we get into the main race recap. I want to showcase here very quickly some of this awesome kit that I've been using across my training, but we'll start here. This is the racing singlet you've seen me use a lot of times. These are a couple of the training tops that you've seen as well. We've got the combat shorts here you've seen every single week that I have banged on about in training. You can see here the pockets. This is where I was stashing the gels during the marathon itself, and of course where I keep my phone during training. They actually have a racing pair of these shorts. So these are the combat shorts, and these here are from the Flow collection. And the Flow collection, just like the vest here, are basically the same shorts but lighter weight material. I didn't actually end up using these because I do need to size up. So if you're considering you've got the combat shorts and you're looking to get the racing version, I would recommend maybe just going a size up. So these are large for me, and I would go extra large in these. These are the training shorts. These have been used a lot as well, and of course some of the training socks I've been using, along with the jacket that you saw me wearing up to Abingdon Marathon. Now of course the discount code is going to be live only until the 31st of October, which means you've only got a few more days to use it before it expires. So make sure you use FODRunner15 for a 15% discount off all Saysky items. As I've shown here, these are just a handful of some of the kit that I've used across the 12 weeks, and I'm so grateful to have had Saysky's support throughout this journey building into Abingdon Marathon. So don't forget, FODRunner15 gets you 15% discount off all Saysky items, only for a few days left. Now it was at this point at mile 5 that I really realised that I had to just go sub 240. Like that was the adaptive goal right there and then, and I would probably be quite foolish to try and push for that sub 230, well 236 to 238. I was hoping a sub 240 should be a nailed on thing, if I'm honest with you. I was feeling that confident, but I knew that I was off pace. And what my strategy was in terms of my watch, I never have mile splits pop on my watch. I'm not interested in that. I was lapping it every sort of 30 minutes roughly manually. The first one went slightly over. You'll see that on Strava. I kind of forgot that I went over 30 minutes. But when I hit lap, I was just kind of trying to, like I have been doing in training, cut those paces down. So I think my average pace at that point was like a 6:12 per mile for those first 5 miles. And that felt really good. So then the goal was going to be for the next section to hold strong, do exactly the same, because I knew for the next 5 miles, pretty much, I'd be going into the wind. And then the third 5 miles, the goal was going to be to cut that right down and get well under sub 240 pace. So we hit that mile 5. The wind hit, and I knew at that point, as I said, sub 240 needs to be the adaptive goal. Another half mile, and we hooked on to that first part of the loop. And so at that point, we kind of turned a bit of a right, had a bit of a reprieve from the wind, but then as soon as we turned left again, that's when it started. So it was quite mild in that first section, which was good. So we kind of got into a good rhythm. That bit's uphill. You don't notice it too much, but we got into a good groove and it felt relatively good along there. So we ticked off sort of like miles 6, 7 and 8, and that's when it really started to hit us, that wind. My average pace on my watch, again, was showing around 6:10, 6:11. So I was bang on track for kind of keeping it exactly where the first 5 miles was. But at that point, as we turned from sort of mile 8 into mile 9, heading out to the top section of the loop, bam, that wind absolutely battered us. We did have a bit of shelter on that first part of the loop, but that second part was so open, it was exposed, fields either side of us, low hedges, so we were just being, what felt like, if I'm honest with you at the time, sort of pushed backwards. Now we did have a good pack at that time. You saw in the vlog that there was about 5 or 6 of us trying to work together. I took myself to the front at that point, tried to help out because a lot of people were taking their turns and I was at the back. It was only fair. We were all trying to work together. We all had the same goal. So I wanted to do my bit for them as well there. So yeah, went to the front there for a little bit, and it was, I won't lie, it was tough. So the goal again at that point was just to get out of that top section to sort of mile 10, 11-ish when we rounded the top, and be at that 6:12 per mile, which I think pretty much ended up being, I was 6:11 or 6:12, which was perfect. So we got to the top of that loop feeling really good, ready to kick on. So I rounded the top corner, we felt the tailwind behind us, started to put the hammer down, and then it was sort of showing 6:03 on my watch, and I was like, brilliant, this is where I want to be. For that first sort of mile, I was cutting it down nicely, and then it went to 6:02, and I did drop a couple of fast miles there, like a 6:03 and a 5:58, and yeah, the tailwind was really working for us. And I knew I didn't want to push too hard at that stage, but I knew that it was really important that we had to start to make up some of that time. So I was trying to kind of like the pack, we were so encouraging of each other. There were some great people in that pack. I've got to shout out all of them. They were absolutely fantastic, great company as well. It was just good fun to run with all of them, and we were talking and chatting. I was like, come on lads, right, we need to kind of crank it down a little bit now, just so that we can give ourselves a chance of going for this sub 240. So we worked well on the second half of that loop, but honestly, we came sort of back around sort of 12, 13, 14 miles, ready to start that second loop. I think we started the second loop around 14 and a half, 15 miles. I can't remember exactly, but I was feeling okay at that point, but I knew that we've worked, even though we had the tailwind, I knew that the tailwind didn't feel quite as beneficial as I thought. And as someone highlighted in the comments, you often find that you work harder working into the headwind than you do with the benefits you get from a tailwind. And that is, I'll be honest with you, hit the nail on the head with it, because that's exactly how it felt. I looked over at one of the lads and I said, what is, they said halfway split, bang on. I said, well, I don't tend to look at halfway splits, but on that moment I said, what was the split? And he said pretty much 121 flat. I was like, brilliant. So we need to run a 118.50 for the second half to run in and come in at 239.50. Absolutely fine. We can do that. No problem at all. So we're quite motivating each other. Great stuff came through the second loop, first section, sort of mile 15, turned on to the headwind again. And at that point, I started to crank it down a little bit, and I started to push, squeeze the pace a bit more, because I knew that at that moment, I couldn't drop back to the 6:12, 6:11 pace that we were doing on the first loop. had to push on a little bit more on that point and squeeze it down to sort of 6:07. Basically, run 240 pace flat for that first section to give ourselves a chance. And that's kind of at the start of it what we did. I was running 6:07, 6:08, and as we got to sort of like 16, 17 miles, again, that's when the real headwind started, and that's when the real challenge happens. It was at 17 miles precisely that I remember kicking on. I was like, right, this is the moment, this is when I'm going for it, this is when the headwind was about to really start, and I knew the headwind was only going to be for sort of like another 1.5 to 2 miles maximum, but I knew that I just had to go at that point, because if I didn't, I was just, my mind had kind of gone, you've run conservative. I was keeping an eye on my heart rate was barely getting into the 160s, it was very solid 150s. I knew that I was absolutely nowhere near my threshold. I knew there was more in the tank, and I just had to trust my body, and I'd done it in training, and let's give it a go. So at that moment, I threw caution to the wind. The pack that I'd been running in had whittled itself down from 6 to 5 to 4, 3, 2, and then I rounded the corner, hit 17, and I noticed the chap I was running with had just dropped back a tiny bit, and it was at that moment I was just like, right, I've just got to go. We've got to go for it. So I went at 17, I put the hammer down, which on Strava, and when you look at the mile splits, it doesn't look like I put the hammer down, but effort levels definitely went up at that point because I was running into the wind, so I was trying to hold pace at that point, and as I said, I knew that I had 2-ish miles to get to 19 and a half at the top of the loop before I could enjoy the tailwind. So I worked quite hard into that wind, trying to maintain pace and effort so that when I got to the top, I could drop the hammer. Rounded the top. I mean, that was brutal. That was the hardest part of the race, I won't lie, but we rounded the top, and I felt relatively good at 19. I was like, right, you've done it. You have got the hardest part out of the way. You've got 7 miles to go now. All you got to do is utilise this tailwind if you can and put the hammer down and go for it. So we rounded the top and I just went for it. And I think the best way to describe these next 7 miles is interesting, because I hit mile 20 and I felt good. I'd lapped the watch in and around that moment in time. I had a calf gel. So I was like, come on, caffeine, do your thing. Give me the boost I need at this moment in time. It just didn't feel like it did at all. I felt like I had my normal gel on board, but that was it. And in terms of gels, they sunk down really well, so that felt good. We'll talk about fueling at the end. And yeah, hit mile 20. Felt okay at that point. Hit mile 21. Felt okay. Mile 22 came, and I was still passing people. There's a lot of back runners at that point that I was just starting to pass. That was becoming a little bit thicker, and I knew we had that thin section of the road, of the track to come, getting out of the loop, and I knew that might be tricky navigating, and ended up not being too bad. But that one section from 22 to 23, it's like, the best way I can describe it is like is a thin cycle track, and it's that bouncy children's tarmac you find in a playground. And my word, it absolutely sucks the life out of your legs. That was probably the hardest part of the course, and really, I guess, the only downside to that loop, because that 9-mile loop is super fast, but that one section can literally, for me, it felt like it broke whatever I had left in me. So I got out the other side of that at mile 23, and at that moment I knew that my goal was out of reach. I'd passed a runner at mile 21 who was in a white horse vest, and I could hear footsteps behind me at just past 23, and he just started to come back past me again. So he had kind of like, he hadn't kicked on, he'd held a steady effort, and I think he came in around sort of like 241, 242-ish. So again, I was kind of thinking to myself, when I looked at the results at the end, I thought maybe I shouldn't have kicked on. But I wasn't there to just be conservative. I was there to just give it a good go. And you know, as a side note, I'm proud of what I did, but obviously it didn't end up quite working out. 24 came, and I just started to slow. 25 came, and I was slowing even more. And the interesting thing was, in that second loop, we were just picking the people off left, right and centre. It was such a good feeling to know that we'd started out well, so that we could utilise the second half, feed off other runners and just pass them. And I'd say in the last sort of 3 miles, I must have got passed by about 5 or 6 runners, which obviously doesn't feel as good, but I was just determined not to stop, feel good. And the interesting thing was, my legs felt absolutely fine. No signs of cramp, no nothing. So that was really good. Just energy levels really started to deplete. Came up onto the final road, saw my wife, she gave me a high five. And that was the boost I needed. Sucked it up, run up into the park, run round the track to finish off in 2:44.02. And I think there are two things I want to touch on very quickly after the race, because obviously afterwards I felt very proud, I felt good. Yeah, the goal wasn't there, the goal time I didn't hit, but I actually didn't come away with any negative feelings. The only frustration I had was with the storm. I was just angry that the weather happened to be how it was at the time. But the reality was, I knew that I went there and gave it my best effort. I said at the beginning of the year, there are 2 marathons this year. London, I want to kind of go and have fun, you know, get into good shape, but just have a bit of fun. I didn't really get into good shape, but got very ill, and that ended up being what it was. But I knew that the second race, I wanted to be in my best shape and give it a go. And I went there and I was like, you have not trained this hard to just kind of be conservative the whole race round. You are a conservative starter and a strong finisher when it comes to races. That's what I like to pride myself on. That's how I like to race. So I knew at that 17-mile mark that this was the time that I had to give it a go. At London, I kicked on just over Tower Bridge at 13 and I faded by 20. So I knew that if I waited another 3 or 4 miles that I would hopefully make it to the end. I didn't quite. So maybe that shows to me that I now need to wait until mile 20 to kick on, which is, you know, absolutely fine. And I will probably try that in the next marathon. But I think overall I just came away feeling very proud. I have no negative feelings, as I said, and I feel quite reassured that I ran my second fastest marathon. Yes, I'm still sort of like 3.5, 4 minutes off of Newport time, but it's okay. I know the shape that I'm in, and I feel really good coming off the back of it. But once again, there's just one thing that I'm left with a question mark over my head. And yep, you guessed it, it's fueling. So in terms of the fueling itself, I had my pre-race gel half an hour before, like I had been testing in my long runs, and that worked really well because I've been having it 10 minutes before, and I would find in a marathon that I would start to feel really sick, and obviously I threw up all over the road in London. I apologise to the people that were around me that saw that. It was disgusting. But in Newport as well, I couldn't sink the 5th gel down on the course, and actually this time I didn't have a 5th gel either. I only got 4 on board, but the difference was this time I didn't feel sick. I got a twinge of sickness in and around when I was meant to have my 5th gel. But it was a twinge. It was nothing more than that. It was nothing that made me go, oh, I'm going to throw up everywhere. It was just like, oh, I feel a bit nauseous. And then within a couple of minutes, it was gone. So obviously I adapted my times of when I had my gel, and when I say I was due to have my 5th gel, that was about 10 minutes from finishing the run. So I had it half an hour before, and then out on the run at Newport I had it at 25 minutes, 50 minutes. So I was having them every 25 minutes. So I had it at 25, 50, 115, 140, and when I went to have it at 205, that's when I couldn't take any more on at Newport. I felt too sick. The interesting thing at Newport is obviously I front loaded the fuel a bit more, and I didn't fade as much, so my faded miles went down to 620s rather than 640 and 50 like it did this time, which shows me that I probably should have tried to fuel every 25 minutes. At Abingdon this time, I did what I did in training, which is fueled every 30 minutes. So I went 30, 1 hour, 130, 2 hours. And I felt like I had enough energy to get to that point. But as I said, the 5th gel was around 230 and I couldn't stomach. I wasn't going to have a gel with 10 minutes to go because I knew that there was no point. I was like at mile, 25-ish. And I was like, there's 1.5 to go. At that moment in time, I wasn't in the mindset of ripping open a gel and having another one. And it kind of went okay. I felt relatively fueled all the way around. And I do feel like it would be interesting to try that again, not on such a windy course, because I sunk the gels fine. I didn't have any sickness. And I think without the wind there, would I have had that energy to maintain to the end? And in my head, I'm like, I don't know. And I don't, part of me says, yes, you might be okay. But part of me says, I'm not. I mean, what we have to remember is these elite athletes are taking on anywhere from sort of like 80 to 100 grams of carbs per hour. They're having their drinks every 5k. So me, as a bigger runner, nearly 90 kilos, and this is something I've always come up against, taking on 2 gels, which effectively, I think the Maurten gels, what am I taking on? I'm not even really taking on 60 grams of carbs an hour, is just, quite frankly, it's not enough. I did enough at Abingdon to get me round the course, but I didn't do enough to fuel me optimally for the race itself. I think I've answered my own question. I know deep down that it's not enough, but I was also quite pleased with how I felt. Like I didn't feel sick and stuff. So it swings and roundabouts there, but I can tell you now, I think it's time that I need to step away from Maurten and I need to have a look at something else, because I feel like other people that I talk to are sinking 6, 7, 8 gels without a problem problem. A lot of people I know sink that many gels. It fuels them optimally, and they can take that throughout a marathon without any issues, without any stomach issues whatsoever. I have some issues with certain gels. There are certain gel brands that I can't take because it makes me shit myself or throw up everywhere. Being completely blunt, my stomach is not the best, so I identified Maurten as a strong contender to being the race gel. And it worked out really well, and it does work okay. But if I'm getting to the point where I can only sink 4 of them and it's too much, then maybe I'm using the wrong fuel. So at this moment in time, I'm going to be doing a bit of reassessment for the next race, which will be next year, and it won't be in spring. I'm having a spring break from marathon, so I'll attack another marathon in autumn next year. What that will be, I don't know yet. I haven't had any plans, and I'm trying not to think about it. But I think I'm going to be going to that using a different fuel source, because it again has been the one thing I think that has just come unstuck slightly here. So I'm not blaming the fuel, but what this has come down to is me sort of coming away, analysing everything and going, right, I think it's time for a little bit of a change. We'll be trying some new brands, seeing what I can sink, seeing different types of gels, doing a lot of testing, ordering a lot of stuff from X Miles basically, and giving that a test over the coming 12 months. Oh, and final positives that I want to share in terms of how I felt post-marathon. The best I've ever felt. Legs didn't cramp. The body feels really good. I felt like I could have carried on training the next day. And I think one of the best things about, I guess, doing marathon after marathon after marathon and continually stacking marathons up and marathon training and taking your mileage up a little bit and getting more conditioned to it is you don't tend to break as much post-marathon. You don't tend to feel as bad, and I've got to say this is the best I've ever walked away from a marathon. So I think I conditioned my body really well. I was really happy with the training anyway, but I'm even more happy with it now. Like I think I was really happy when I looked back on paper going, I've executed all of these sessions. That feels really good. But as I said, post race, sat here in a caravan because we're on holiday for the week, I feel even better. Like I could be running this week if I wanted to, and I wouldn't think anything of it. All I would think is I'd just done a hard long run. And that comes down to a couple of things. My heart rate was super low. As I said, I never got near threshold. This was the lowest heart rate average I have ever had on a marathon. So I mentioned this after London, and that's because I was ill. But Newport, my average heart rate was 164. London this year was 150, and bearing in mind at Newport I ran 240 and 48 seconds. London I ran 257. It was a bit of a disaster, but my heart rate was 158. And this time I ran 244.02, and my average heart rate is 156, which is nuts. And again, I think all the training I do is conditioning me really well in that lower aerobic zone like I do a lot of zone 2 running, and a lot of my marathon pace runs are very much a case of low zone 3, mid zone 3, very controlled. And I think I've just got to the point now where I'm super efficient in that area. It's just the top area that I'm absolutely appalling in, but I feel really good about that. So I know that I've taken big steps. I know my efficiency is getting better. There's a lot of massive positives to take from it. So the heart rate was wonderful to see. And as I said, in terms of how I feel and how my body is, yeah, I feel like I can go out and run, which is a wonderful feeling. So I think we'll leave it there, guys. Talked a little bit about the prep, went through the race itself, talk about the fueling, which is still, as I said, that bone of contention for me. But as I said, I'm not complaining about it this time. I'm not going to blame the race on it. I felt really, really good, but I think it's time to definitely change and switch it up. And yeah, the positives coming off the back of it was really, really good. So I'm going to sit down and enjoy the rest of my holiday. Obviously, no videos this week. First week off from YouTube in a very long time. I'm excited to spend a bit of time with the family. They've given up so much for me. I put it in a community post, but I think the reality is that when I was trying to do my Sunday training vlog and my Monday long run vlog to get them back to back, what I often find is I'm doing a lot of editing over the weekend, and obviously that eats into family time when you work in the week. So it's really important for me to just not only just switch off this week, as I do anyway. I always take off a week after marathon, 5 to 7 days as a minimum. Probably 5 this time. I'll probably get back out on Saturday and have a light jog, and then resume some form of low-key training on Monday. But it's always really important just to have a break, even if you feel really good, just from a mental perspective. But also from my family, they gave up a lot. As I said, I lost a lot of time with them over the last 12 weeks. So I'm excited excited to just come away here and just have fun, eat everything, and do all the stuff that I wouldn't normally do, and yeah, just have a good time. So I appreciate your support. Thank you so much for following on this series. Thank you so much for your support on the Abingdon vlog. It means the world to me. I'm going to head off now. I'll see you guys on the next one when we'll resume normal uploads and get back into some exciting stuff in the lead up to Christmas. The next video we'll be talking about what's next, and then we'll be straight back into the thick of things. So I will see you guys on the next one. Thanks so much for your support. If you enjoyed this one, please do consider giving it a like, share it with your friends, and of course subscribe to the channel for weekly running content. See you in the next one.